Hey, beauty friends, welcome to the Michael's class, 5 things you should never do when making beaded jewelry. While we are waiting for our live participants to bop in to our class today, please feel free to go ahead and say hey in the comments. Let me know where you're from, and I always like to know if this is the first class that you have taken with me for Michael's, or if you're a seasoned regular, you know me from my Facebook Lives, you know me from Beadalon, you know me from everywhere. But if you don't know me, I'm Meredith Roddy, and I work for Beadalon and Artistic Wire, and I'm very excited to be presenting this class for Michael's today. This is one of my absolute favorite topics to talk about when it comes to jewelry making, because what we're going to be going over today are the 5 things you should never do while making beaded jewelry. But in there, we're going to talk about all of the different things that you should be doing when you're making beaded jewelry. This is one of those foundation classes that is great for people who are just starting on their jewelry making journey, because I'm going to tell you everything that you shouldn't do, but also all of the things that you should do. But I think it's also a really good class for seasoned jewelry making people who've been doing this maybe for years. I always find that someone says, "Oh, I've been doing that wrong all of this time," or "Oh gosh, I never knew that." So hopefully everyone, no matter what your skill level, no matter where you are in your journey of jewelry making, you will find something valuable from this class. So, oh my goodness, we have a lot of beady friends in here today, and the comments are scrolling by very, very quickly. So if you are watching us live and you have a question, or something that I said kind of wasn't quite clear enough, feel free to write that in the comments. If things are scrolling by nice and slowly, I will be able to see it and address it in class. But if not, Yvette is here from Beadalon as well. She is in the chat room, and she will be there to provide links and to answer any questions that you have. And of course, this class is being recorded. So if you have to cut out halfway through, or if you are joining us on the replay, you can fast forward, rewind, go back and forth and listen to me till you are sick of hearing my voice, but you have learned all of the things. So, oh, this is wonderful. So we have some people who are new, so welcome. Thank you so very much for joining me. And also, for those of you who have been here for a long time, looks like we have some long timers here as well. Welcome. Now, remember, when you are watching on different devices, your settings could affect how you see me. So if you're watching on the replay, you'll see my face. And then when we go to the camera with my hands, you'll see my hands. But you might have to go right up to the right-hand side where it says view and make sure that that view is showing me. Sometimes on different devices, if people have their Zoom settings in different ways, it affects how you are able to interact and see me. So I think that is all of the housekeeping that I have to chit chat about before we get right into it. So Felicia, you can go ahead, flip me down to the bottom camera, and we are going to start talking about the 5 things that you should never do when making beaded jewelry. So the first thing that I always, that's my 100% top thing that you should never do when making jewelry, is when you are going to crimp at the end of your design or at the beginning of the design, do not. This is my biggest do not. Do not use a chain nose pliers or a flat nose pliers to flatten the crimp. Okay, I have made up here an example of kind of all of the things that you shouldn't do when you are making a beaded design. And you can see here, let's see, it's always a challenge to see how close I can get and still stay in focus. See how that crimp is flattened? Please, please, please don't do that. So let me show you what I mean. So when you have a piece of jewelry and you are going to finish it, you are going to use a crimp tube or a crimp bead. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about crimp tubes and crimp beads as we go through our class today. But when you are using your crimp tube or your crimp bead and you are stringing it on and you are, sorry about that, guys, that's my mom calling me. So let me just pop this up real quick and back down again. It's always good when mom wants to make an appearance on the Michaels classes. She'll get a kick out of that later on. So I'm going to put my clasp on here, and of course we're going to come back around and down through our crimp. Now, we do not want to come in here with our flat nose pliers and flatten this down. I think sometimes people learn this the wrong way. Sometimes people just think that this is the easiest thing to do. But what ends up happening is when you are using the flat nose pliers or the chain nose pliers, what you're doing is actually smushing all of those wires against each other. And each of these, each beading wire is made up of either 7, 19, or 49 teeny tiny little strands of wire. And that's what makes beading wire so strong. Well, if you come in here and flatten that down, all you are doing is just smushing the wires. It is never, never, never a good idea to do. What you want to do is use a crimp tool. So here I have my standard crimping tool. And for those of you who don't know, you can see the different notches on the crimping tool. So there's one in the front that is a smooth oval, one in the back that has a little lip, a little divot that comes down, a little point. And those are the two notches in the crimping pliers. And so the proper way to crimp is to make sure that you start in the front of those crimping pliers. So oftentimes when we have learned, or when people have learned to crimp, you start in the back, but it's actually, you want to start in the front, then go to the back, and then come to the front again. Okay, so I'm going to squeeze that front plier. I'm going to squeeze the plier with the crimp in that front part. And what that does is it creates an oval. And what that oval does is it makes it easier to have the two wires lay side by side. So I talked about how when you use the chain nose pliers, it flattens those wires down. Well, in this case, you want the wires to be next to each other, because if they're crossed in that crimp tube, that is also going to put unnecessary and unwanted strain on your wires. So when we're making jewelry, we want to not only worry about our beautiful design, but for jewelry that is going to last and stand the test of time, you really want to make sure that you pay attention to the fundamentals of construction. So now I'm going to come in here in my back notch, and I am going to gently compress it down. And you can see that one wire is on one side of the crescent and one wire is on the second side of the crescent. Okay, so that was the second part. So the first part I came in the front, second part I went to the back, and now I'm going to come back to the front again. And I'm going to take that little crescent, and it's kind of, it's not kind of, it is horizontal right now. And I'm going to turn it so it is vertical. And I'm going to use that front part of my crimping pliers to bend it down around on itself. And now you can see that I am moving that crimp around in the crimping pliers. I'm not just doing it once and forgetting about it. I'm not crimping it down as tight as I can because the way that the tool is designed, you can only crimp it down so far. And the last thing that I am not doing, please everybody say it with me, I will not come in here and smush that crimp in the front of the pliers. It is so tempting. I'll admit it, I'll cop to it. When I first started making jewelry, I did that also because it's so tempting, right? You want it to be as secure as possible and get, and smush that wire up because you think to yourself, well, if I smush that wire around, I smush that crimp around, I'm going to hold the wire more securely. That is not what's going to happen. What is actually going to happen is you are going to smush the wires and then break the wires, because once again, and I'm going to get to this in I think tip 3 or 4, these wires are very, very thin, and the more they are together, the stronger they are. But we don't want to break them. We don't want to put extra strain on them that doesn't want to be there. So the crimp tool is designed so that if you follow that 1, 2, 3 step process, your crimps should hold tightly every time. So the second thing that you should never do when you are making beaded jewelry is to add a clasp without any wiggle room in here. So you see, this is a little much. This is probably about 2 or 3 millimeters more wiggle room than I usually will allow for. But you can see here in this example that I don't have any wiggle room here. So what's happening is that beading wire is right as tight as I can get it against that clasp and as tight as I could get it against that crimp tube. There we go, against that crimp tube. And what is happening is everything has too much pressure on it. And what happens is with wear and tear, the friction will end up cutting through that wire, and then your jewelry will break and fall apart. So you always want to add just that little bit of wiggle room. I always make sure that my clasp has enough room to dangle. That's kind of a good rule of thumb. If you need more precise measurements, 1/4 of an inch, a centimeter, that's usually a good amount also. And your jewelry will end up, I think, looking nicer. The way to ensure that this wiggle room is always built in is to use a wire guardian. And where are my nippers? Here they are. So for those of you who don't know what a wire guardian is, it is a little horseshoe shaped piece of metal that is always better when it's in focus. There we go. It's a little horseshoe shaped piece of metal and it's hollow. So what you do with this is you first you have to string your crimp tube, of course, let's not forget that. Let's see, where did my crimp tubes go? This is one of those classes where I have so much stuff out on the beading mat that of course I can never find what I need. Anybody else feel that? Whenever you have all this stuff out, you can never find what you need. So first things first, we're going to put on our crimp tube. Let me see if I can move this down just a little bit so we can really see what's going on here. So now we are going to go up one side of the horseshoe and come around and down the second side of that horseshoe. Okay. And so now I want my crimp tube to get all jacked up in there, but I do need to not forget to add my clasp. So I'm going to grab a clasp. Well, I'm just using lobster claw clasps just because I happen to have a whole bunch of them in a pile over here, but you could be doing this with any kind of clasp, a toggle clasp, an S-hook clasp. The same philosophy applies to any clasp that you are using for this. So I tend to use crimp tubes. And the only reason for that is because for me, I find that they are easier to crimp. I think that they look nicer for how I do it, but I know people who work at Beadalon even, who swear by crimp tubes. They think that they look prettier. They find it easier for to be able to crimp the crimp beads. I use crimp beads and crimp tubes interchangeably, but when I actually am crimping, I will generally use a crimp tube. They act the exact same way. They are calibrated the exact same way. You use the crimp tube with them, or I'm sorry, the crimp tool with them the exact same way. So I do see a number of questions coming through, and it's all information that I'm going to get to as we are going through the all 5 things. All right, so this is kind of a bonus tip. With the wire guardians, you want to make sure that you take your chain nose pliers and very gently close, let's get a better, there we go. Very gently close the tips together. It's one of those things that some people didn't learn when they learned how to use wire guardians, but this, not only do I think it looks better, but when those tips are out, they can be a little scratchy. So just gently, gently, gently bringing those tips together is a really good way to finish off your jewelry. And you can see now that wiggle room is built in. So I don't have to do any guesswork. I don't have to worry about, oh, is it too close? Is it too far away? And now I have my clasp with exactly a perfect amount of space in between the crimp tool, or I'm sorry, the crimp tube. Oh, my words are getting all messed up today. And then since I feel like we can't watch this too many times, I'm just going to come here and I'm going to crimp down. So I'm in that first notch to make an oval. See how I'm holding my 2 pieces of beading wire away from each other? Then I'm going to come back into the back notch, squeeze down, one's on one side, one's on the other side. I'm going to take my horizontal crescent or bean or whatever shape you like to refer it to, and then put it in between those jaws. And again, squeeze down and then move my tool around and around and around and around and around. Okay. And what am I not doing? If we can refer back to number 1, I am not coming in here and smushing this in the front of my pliers. It is so tempting. I know, I feel it. I feel the temptation, but don't do it that way. Okay, so I think that we covered number 1, which is don't use a chain nose pliers, always use a crimp tool. Number 2, which is do not add a clasp without leaving wiggle room. You always need that little bit of wiggle room. And the bonus tip there is using a wire guardian. Always always puts that perfect amount of wiggle room. It also helps reduce the abrasion of the clasp. So you have an extra piece of metal here that is helping with your construction of your jewelry. So moving on to number 3, and this is always this is the question that we get asked in the Beadalon office the most. This is the most challenging of all of the pieces of information when you are starting or when you are in the middle of your jewelry making. And that is, do not guess the size of the crimp beads and the crimp tubes. Check the label and make sure that you are using the right size for the beading wire that you are using. Okay, so that is a lot of words. There's a lot of information that is all tied up in the number 3. So let's break it down from the very, very beginning. This is bead stringing 101. First, we have 7 strand, then we have 19 strand, and then we have 49 strand. And what this refers to, the 49 strand is a really good example. That is how many individual wires are all bundled together under this nylon coating. So here we have 49 strands all bundled together. It's actually 7 bundles of 7 strands. Then here we have 19 strands all bundled together. And then here we have an old spool. So it does not show the 7 strands, but trust me, there are 7 strands all bundled together here. It's part of the challenges of working from home. You gotta use what you can when you're doing that. So 7 strands, 19 strands, 49 strands. And as I think you can see, the more strands that you have, the stronger your wire is. So diameter to diameter to diameter, your wire will be strongest and the most flexible and the most supple in 49 strand. It will be the medium amount of those things in 19 strand, and it will be the least of those things. It will be the stiffest and the least strong in 7 strand. Now, second thing to pay attention to on the wire spool is the diameter. So here I have a 0.024 diameter. I have a 0.018 diameter. I pulled out also at Michael's, you'll find a 0.015 diameter and a 0.012 diameter. So the 0.012 diameter is very, very fine. You can see, I'm going to pull this out here. And let me move these out of the way so you can really, really see the difference. Pull some off. I have a tendency to always leave the clips on my wire. I don't know. I think it's something from shows that you don't want the wire to get too unruly. So this is the 012, and then here I have the 024. So let me just bring that up to the camera so you can really see the difference in those 2 wires. So the 012 is very thin and the 024 is much, much thicker. And this is important because you always want to fill your bead holes as much as you can when you are making jewelry. Okay, so file that little tidbit away because we're gonna talk about that again in a little bit. But let's go back to our 7, 19, and 49 strand wires. And now we're going to get to the choosing of the correct size crimp tube and crimp bead. So here on my 015, I think I switched this out. It was 018 before, but same rules apply. We show you right on the spool which size crimp tube to use and which size crimp bead to use. Now, the numbering system is not mine. So they don't line up number 2 to number 2. I don't know why. I wish I did. I wish I had come up with the numbering system because it would be more consistent, but I didn't. So number 1 crimp beads. Yeah, I'll do that all the time. And number 2 crimp tube is what you use for this wire. If you were using an 024 wire, you've got a choice. You can use a number 2 or number 3 crimp bead or a number 2 or number 3 crimp tube. Now, I'll let you know that I usually size down. I usually on my 49 strand, on my 024, whether it's 49 strand, 19 strand, whatever, if it's an 024 diameter, I will generally use a number 2 crimp tube. I think for me, it is easier to crimp and it looks nicer. If I was a crimp bead person, I would probably size down to the number 2 crimp bead as well. And if I have crimp beads lying around, I will use them. But like many things in life, we have our preferences, right? And I am a crimp tube kind of a user. And you use the same tool, whether you're using the beads or you are using the tubes. This is good to know also because when you get the variety packs of crimp tubes, which I really like getting because then you get your crimp tubes or your crimp beads in these nice little vials, and they're really, really good. It's a really good way to keep them from disappearing. Although mine always seem to disappear. I actually ended up putting them all in a little storage container, so I would always be able to find my crimp beads and crimp tubes. And again, I use it interchangeably. Crimp beads and crimp tubes, the names of them both. So let's make sure I got all of those things. So you want to make sure that you match up the right ones. And I'm going to give a really good demonstration on why that's important. So say I am using an 012, well, let's use the 015 beading wire. So that's something that would be a little bit more common. So say I'm using the the 015 beading wire. And it depends on a lot of different things in your design, whether or not you would use the 7, 19, or 49 strand wire. 19 strand is a really good mid-range wire. Sometimes it comes down to price. 7 strand is much more economical to buy a spool of than 49 strand. However, at Beadalon, and especially when you are making professional jewelry to sell or to gift, I always recommend 19 or 49 strand, because inch for inch, the price differential is really a non-issue. But 7 strand is a really good place to start. We call it kind of a craft wire, an introduction to the market wire, but I almost exclusively use 49 strand or 19 strand in my designs. And so here on the spool, it recommends either a number 1 crimp bead or a number 2 crimp tube. So I'm actually going to, I want to see, I don't think I have any crimp beads in this container, but I will show the difference between a crimp bead and a crimp tube as we are going along. So here I have a number 4 crimp tube, and you can see, where is what I am looking for? See, that's what happens when I move everything out of the way. Here is the number 2, and here is the number 4. So you can see, I mean, just with your naked eye, the difference. So this is what is recommended, the number 2, but I'm going to use a number 4 to really show what happens when you don't measure, when you don't align your crimp sizes to the size of the wire, which is also a segue into number 4, which is you always want to make sure that you're using the right crimp tool for your projects. So let me first show you what happens when I use this number 4 crimp tube with, just grab another little clasp over here. I think it's easier to show when you're actually clasping to a clasp. And so I bought a variety pack. I have these number 4 crimp tubes. So I'm going to try to use my standard crimping plier to crimp this. So I'm going to come in the front and I'm going to smush this down, and you can see that it just mashed and mangled that crimp. There was nothing good that happened there. And so if I come in the back and I try to do the second part, I can barely even fit it in there. But if I do, it just mangled that crimp. The whole thing is just not going to work at all. The other thing that can happen here, and I did a pretty good job of mangling this, but let's finish her off and come in here in the front. So not only is this all mangled, but if you don't do it well, you run the risk of it pulling out. I had back when I was first learning how to make jewelry, I didn't know this, and so I was using a 0.012 wire with bigger crimps than I should have, and I was probably flattening my crimps at that point too, because I am a learn by mistake kind of a learner. And so I put my bracelet on and the whole thing just fell apart. And so that's how I was able to kind of go through and diagnose and figure out, wow, I was using the wrong size and the wrong everything. So let's talk about now the different sizes of crimp tools. So we have, and at Michael's, there is the micro, I think it says micro, yeah, micro crimping pliers right here, the standard crimping pliers here, and then the mighty crimping pliers. And you can see the differences in their jaws pretty well when you're looking at them all side by side. So that micro crimper is really small. The standard crimper is probably what most people are familiar with. And then the mighty crimper, this guy is actually a workhorse. He has a lot of different things that he can do, not just crimping. But you want to make sure that if you are using something that calls for a number 1 crimp tube or a size 0 or number 1 crimp bead, micro crimping pliers is the one that is going to calibrate the right way. If you are using a size number 2 or 3 crimp bead, size number 2 or 3 crimp tube, that is going to be the standard crimping pliers. And then for that size 3 crimp tube and size 3 crimp bead, size 4 crimp tubes, even I have to think about it for a second. The mighty crimping pliers are the ones that you want to use for that. And we have charts on all of these things on the Beadalon website. So if you go into our learning center and start poking around in all of the different places that you can poke around in, but then it becomes, once you practice it and once you do it over and over again, it becomes kind of second nature to know which crimp tool corresponds to which crimp bead or crimp tube. Okay, so the last tip before I do some supplemental and additional tips is that you don't want to stick with one size of beading wire for all of your designs. And I touched on that a little bit when we talked about diameters. So let me line these back up again and kind of go back and talk a little bit more about diameters and what you would use each diameter for. So 0.012, 0.015, 0.018, and 0.024. These are the 4 diameters that are available in Michael's. I also mentioned, if you were paying attention, that you always want to make sure that you fill up your bead holes as much as you can, because what ends up happening when you are stringing up your designs is your beads move around a lot. Actually, that's a bad example because that's another thing not to do. Your beads are going to move around a lot. And if your bead holes are big, and if, for example, on these crystals, your bead holes can be really sharp. So you want to reduce the amount of friction and the amount of movement as much as you can in order to create a situation that your bead wire and your jewelry is going to be as strong and as long lasting as possible. So that is why we have so many different diameters. So if you have little teeny tiny beads with little teeny tiny holes, of course that 012 is going to be perfect. Big beads with big holes, well, of course the 024 wire is going to be the one that you reach for. And in all honesty, unless I'm using beads with very, very small holes, my go-to beading wire is not this one, it's this one, is a 49 strand 024, because this is going to be the strongest beading wire for my designs. So you can certainly over construct your jewelry, which is what I tend to do. And a 49 strand 024 wire is going to be great for that. So one of the things that I also wanted to mention back on number 2, when we talk about wiggle room, what we were talking about there is creating enough room here at the end of our design that the clasp has enough room to wiggle, right? However, there's another bit of wiggle room, which is also really important. And if you leave with nothing else, please leave with this information. You want to make sure that there is also wiggle room within your design. So this is kind of my example of all of the things not to do, right? I flattened my crimp, don't do that. I didn't leave wiggle room on the end here, don't do that. But what I also did is I strung my design up really, really tight. So one of the things that we as jewelry makers tend to do when we are making jewelry is pick the jewelry up after we've done the one side, tighten everything up so that there's no wire showing at all. But what ends up happening is, do you see how I can't even get this wire together because it's just too tight. So what ends up happening is not only will these beads all crack if I try to force this together, but the wire will end up having so much tension on it that it's going to snap. Now, this is an extreme example that I like to show because it really drives home the point of how important it is to think about the construction of your jewelry. So I use the exact same cube beads here, but instead of doing them all next to each other, I put a little seed bead in between each one. And what that is going to do is it's going to allow that bracelet the flexibility of closing, right? Because it's a bracelet, it needs to go around on your wrist, right? So this isn't going anywhere. And all it's going to do is cut through the wire, break the crystals. Nobody wants that to happen. So I'm going to show a couple more times just that proper crimping technique again. And this time I'm going to grab a bead, a crimp bead. And this is, let's see, I'm going to put it right here. No, I'm not going to put it right there. The beads also tend to be a little bit rollier. Let's see if we can get a nice close up of that bead without it falling off of my finger. It'll be easier to see when I get it onto the wire also. So I'm going to string my crimp bead onto the wire, and I'm going to grab yet another clasp. It'll be fun to cut all of these examples apart after class, around and back through my crimp bead. And I am just using my thumbnail to get that nice and appropriately wiggle roomed. And see, notice I did not say nice and tight, just close enough. So I have this wiggle room in here. And because I'm using a size number 1 crimp bead, I'm using these standard pliers. I am going to come in the front and compress it down. And this part, nothing here is a death grip. I'm going to come back into the back jaw of my pliers and round that into that nice crescent half moon shape, and then back in to the front of the pliers. And some people think that a crimp bead looks nicer, and that is fine. I oftentimes, and before we end class, I'm also going to show how to add a crimp cover. See, lots and lots of bonus material. You know, it does look nice. Maybe I will switch to crimp beads. It's funny, whenever I do the crimp bead, I'm always like, oh, I really should do that. But then I have I look over and all of my crimps are tubes. Okay, so, and I don't know if people notice, but I always is a strong word. I mostly always work directly from the school. For those of you who have taken many of my classes before, you will have seen me do that. It helps me waste less wire. And oftentimes I'm just kind of trying something out. And so I can string it up on the wire and then go ahead and take it off, and I haven't wasted any wire. And I didn't always do that. So I always like to mention that as part of the class, because it's one of those things that sometimes you don't think about. Okay, so now another really good tip is here on the end, I have started/ended with a small bead. So instead of just going straight up with my crystals next to each other, and clearly that's not working for any sort of a design, but I now have a size 11 a size 11 seed bead in between each of these crystals. And you can just see already how much different this design is going to lay. But I want to make sure that I also end with a small bead. So starting and ending your design with a smaller bead, whether it's a size 11 seed bead, a size 8 seed bead, a 4mm round, maybe a 3mm round. Whatever it is, it's always better to end with a smaller bead. It just helps bring the wire together. It helps with maintaining the integrity of the design. So let's come and we'll use a crimp bead again on this side. And what I was mentioning before is, here, let me pull my camera up so you can really see. One of the tendencies that we have, especially when we're first designing, is to bring our bracelet or our necklace up and make sure all of this is as tight as possible. But what happens if all of this is as tight as possible is it puts way too much tension and pressure on these beads. Because I have those size 11s in there, I'm not going to need to work in nearly as much wiggle room, but I always, this really is an always, make sure that before I crimp my necklace or my bracelet or my whatever I'm making in a round form that's going to be a round piece of jewelry, I make sure that I close I close it to the clasp. So I'm just going to use a little tag over here on the other side and bring this around. And because I'm using 024 wire, it's not going to slide neatly through that bead right there. I'm okay with that for the purposes of teaching. If I was making this into an actual piece of jewelry, I might redesign it so that I could slip my excess wire in. So instead of making sure that this was all as super tight as it possibly could be with no wire in the middle, what I'm going to do before I crimp it is to close the circle, to finish the clasp, or I'm sorry, to clasp the clasp. And then I want to make sure that my little loop here that I've already done, that the one on this side matches as close as I can get it. And this too is where using a wire guardian comes in really, really handy, because then you don't have to worry about it being, about eyeballing it. You always know that it's going to be the right size. So come in here in the very front, then back in the very back, and then switch it from horizontal to vertical. And round that around, being careful not to grab that glass seed bead because it will snap. And if I were making this for something other than an example, I would definitely make sure to pull my wire back through several of the beads beforehand. It's structurally, it really doesn't do anything, but what it avoids is having any sort of little owie poking out here, or visually having a little end there. I was able to get mine really tight, so it's not an issue. But it is something that I do when I make jewelry. And so you can see, because I put those size 11 seed beads in there and I added in the right amount of wiggle room, very different from this one here. The same will hold true for rondelle beads. So not everybody uses the cubes. I just like demonstrating it because it really drives the point home. But the same thing will happen with rondelle beads, which are much more common. So I'm just holding this really, really tight, and you can see how doing that same exercise with the rondelle beads really hinders your ability to have a nice drapey piece of jewelry, even when you're using 49 strand wire. So the last thing that I wanted to show is adding a crimp tube to adding a crimp cover to a crimp tube. So I think, yeah. So I just wanted to show also, since these beads have much bigger holes, that you can tuck your ends in here. And these are little cube beads. So you would also make sure that you would need to add in that wiggle room. And I'm just going to finish this one off also. I think that it's good to show finishing off as many times as you possibly can. And I have a little bit of extra time here and the end. And so you wanted to see the blue bracelet flat on the table to see the endings. That is the way that the end of the blue bracelet ended up. Will it stay like that forever? I can make no guarantees, but for right now, that's how that blue bracelet is. It actually turned out really, really pretty. Those Pacific blue opal, I believe, is the color of those Swarovski crystals. All right, so I used a number 2 crimp bead, so I'm going to do that again. And the thing about beads from Michaels, which I really like, is generally they have larger holes. I've noticed that with the gemstones. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble getting this guy open. I've noticed that with the gemstones. I've noticed that with the glass beads. I have always been able, can I say always? Let's say almost always, been able to use an 024 wire with my beads that I have purchased from Michaels. And I like that because I know that I'm going to be able to fill my bead holes as much as possible with my 024 wire. So for that, and especially if you are going into Michaels, it can be really daunting, right? There is so much there. There's so many shiny things that are hitting you from every different angle. And so what I would recommend for a beginner is to find some beads that you like first, right? And then you can generally, if you have a strand of beads from Michaels, this is what I do when I'm in the store. So trade secret here, right? Okay, so I have a bead and I'm thinking about what I'm gonna do. What I'll do is I'll go like this and I'll look at those holes. And so I know just from years of experience that those are pretty good size holes. And so an 024 wire is going to be great for that. And then I'll come over here and I'll be like, ooh, these are small beads, but they still have a really nice big hole. Let's see if I'm going to make sure I have that in focus. So that is a really good way to kind of start eyeballing and seeing what to use for your designs. Oh my gosh, I'm in love with this bracelet. I just kind of strung it up and was like, meh, but now I think this is going to be one of the ones that I keep. Okay, so I'm going to come in here one last time and see how someone had asked the question of stringing your beading wire back through. That's what I did. So I came up here through my crimp tube, up and around, back through, and I'm tightening everything up, but not so tight. I want to make sure that this has not lots of nice wiggle room, because I didn't add anything in between these beads, but I have it closed. I don't have any wires showing. I am happy. So now I'm going to come in here, and one last time I'll show the 3-step crimping process. So I'm going to come in the front jaws of my crimpers to make that nice oval shape. I'm going to put that oval shape in the back jaw of my crimpers. It gets very difficult when you've got all that stuff going on, and just a gentle compression. And you can feel when everything stops, so you don't have to, no death grips necessary. And then this last part where you come around and just gently close and move your tool around. And I know I've said it before, but I'm going to say it again because everybody wants to do it. And I want you to come away from this class not doing it. Do not come up here in the front and smush it again. This is done. This is perfect. Okay. And depending on the size of your wrist and your comfort level, that will determine what size your bracelet is. So I have a pretty small wrist, and I always say wrist size is not indicative of person size. And I like to have the my bracelets fit tighter, like this bracelet, this little cuff that I'm wearing here, and these ones over here. I like them to fit tighter. But my mom, for example, likes her bracelets to kind of come down here and be really loose. So it depends. It really depends on what your preference is, what your friend or your customer's preference is. 7.5 is kind of the standard length for a bracelet, but 7.5 is way too big for me, which is why I actually tend to make adjustable sliding bracelets. And if you go back through on the archives of the Michael's Community Classroom, you can find a couple of projects that I did that use that technique of making the adjustable bracelet, because then you don't have to worry about it. You just know that that the person can choose their own size. It's like choosing your own adventure. Okay, so at Michael's, you can also find this fun and fabulous variety pack of crimp covers. So there are, it's like a corrugated finish design, a sparkle finish design, and spoiler alert, those are my favorite. And then 2 different sizes, 3mm and 4mm. They've of course gotten a little bit mixed up, but a crimp cover is a perfect way to finish off your design. And so in talking all about the different things that you should never do and all of the things that you should do, the crimp covers are a great way to finish off our discussion. So you just kind of have to wiggle this guy in here to get the crimp cover to cover your crimp tube or your crimp bead. And there are, these are 4mm. That's generally going to be sufficient for most of your crimping needs. That will fit over a size 1, size 2, and size 3 crimp tube and a 0, 1, and 2 size crimp bead. See how I always have to slow down when I'm saying that to make sure I have everything correct. So there are at least two, probably more ways of doing this. I like using my chain nose pliers to just come in here and very gently squeeze my crimp cover shut. So I kind of work it from all angles, and it is a slow movement. Crimp covers, at least in my opinion, closing them up and getting those edges nice and tight is not a one and done proposition. Much like crimping, you kind of have to go around and zhuzh it a little bit this way, zhuzh it a little bit that way. And then finally, you are happy with how it worked out. And if I had been thinking, and I might restring this with a wire guardian on the end just to make it look just that much more finished. The other thing that you can do when you are using a crimp cover is to close it with your mighty crimpers. Okay. This one, this one works too. I like to show, I'm nothing if not a person who likes to show different ways of doing things, because we all learn differently, right? And we all have different tools and we all have different ways that we like to do things. So maybe my favorite way of doing something isn't your favorite way of doing something. Maybe I love crimp tubes, but you swear by crimp beads and you won't use anything else. And that's okay. Just need to finagle this guy. And sometimes your crimp covers are closed a little bit more than you want them to. And what you can do is very carefully, not to poke yourself, is use a beading awl to open that crimp tube up a little bit. Sometimes it works better than other times, but the beading awl is my tool of choice to open up crimp covers. So let's see if that worked enough. And if not, I will grab another one. Let's see. We're gonna try a different one here instead of fiddling around with trying to get it open. And that will happen. It's just kind of the way that they are made and manufactured. Sometimes you got to open them up. Let's try a sparkle one this time because it's really pretty. And I'm restringing this anyway. So having non-matching bead or crimp covers isn't going to matter. All right, look, my fiddly fingers. We wanted to have a strong finish and I'm just having a fiddly finish, which is, that's kind of par for the course here. Let me see if I can jerry rig this just a little bit to prove the point and get this on, because I really want to show everybody how you should always have the folded toward the opening of the crimp cover. I have never heard that. I think that it just naturally happens because it's easier to get the crimp in that way. But you can see I'm really struggling with this. Let's try opening this one up a little bit. Just bear with me for 1 second, friends. I will make this work. And that's sometimes something that happens when you're making jewelry, right? You're trying to do something and you have something in your mind that you want it to work in a certain way. And then for whatever reason, it's not working. That's why I love watching different designers, different artists, different teachers showing different ways of doing things. Because as I was saying before, what might work for one person might not necessarily, there we go, work best for the other person. Whew. All right. Need to take a deep breath now that I got that on. All right. So now let's come in with the mighty crimpers. And once again, just small movements to get that crimp cover together and rounded. So nice small movements. And now we have an even more professional finish, because on this side I did add that wire guardian. So wire guardian, crimp cover, lots of nice wiggle room, and a perfect bracelet. So just to review the 5 things you should never do while making jewelry that we went over today. So the first thing that we talked about was not using your chain nose pliers to crimp down your crimps. You always, and this isn't always, want to use your crimping pliers. The second thing we talked about is making sure that there was enough wiggle room in between your clasp. And then we also talked about making sure you had enough wiggle room between your beads. We also talked about making sure that you don't guess the size of which crimp bead or crimp tube to use, because we tell you right on the spool. We will always let you know. So you'd never have to worry about finding any resource online. Your spool of beading wire will tell you what you need to know. In the same vein, you want to make sure that you use the right crimping tool. So there are 3 crimping tools: the micro crimper, the standard crimper, and then the mighty crimper. And each of those calibrates with a specific size of crimp bead or tube, which also calibrates with a specific size of wire. And then lastly, don't stick with one size of beading wire for all designs. You always want to make sure that you choose the largest diameter that will fill up your bead holes as much as possible. So in following all of these rules and more, because we covered a lot in this class, hopefully you'll be able to take your designs from amateur to intermediate to professional, and they will last for a lifetime. You won't have any frustrations. You will only have fun. And that's what this is all about, is creating, is putting together all of this knowledge to make a beautiful piece of jewelry, either for yourself or for a gift or to sell. There have been so many. You see how the sunlight just came streaming through the window right there. Oh my gosh. The sun just came out, so that's a beautiful thing. Now that class is almost over, I can go out and enjoy the beautiful day. No, back to work with me. Thank you all very, very much, everybody, for participating. There have been wonderful questions in the chat room. This class will be posted on the Michael's Community Classroom YouTube channel in a day or so, sometimes even earlier. And also the Beadalon website is a huge resource, beadalon.com, for a huge resource for all of this information. We have it broken down in several different ways, because I know people learn things in different ways. And so perhaps if I explain something one way, it doesn't click, but if I explain something in another way, then it will click for you. So Wednesdays at 2 o'clock are the Beadalon classes on the Michael's Community Classroom. We're also starting to offer some classes on Saturdays as well. So I always learn something from talking to students. I always learn something from taking classes. So thank you everyone for sticking with me to the bitter end today. And until next time, happy beading.